You're listening to Speak Up and Stay Alive, Patient Safety Radio, and I am your hostess, Pat Rulo. If you heard my healthcare hazard of the week a few weeks ago, you'll remember that I spoke about the epidemic of drugging our children and how that has resulted in a total of 20 million children on psychiatric drugs, and this sadly rests on one fraudulent premise, and that is that mental disorders are biological diseases and therefore justifies the use of mind-altering drugs. And today I'm so pleased to have an expert guest with us to add more substance to that statement. He is Bruce Wiseman. Bruce is the U.S. President of the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. He testified before both bodies of both houses of the United States Congress, as well as state legislative and judicial bodies. He has also testified before the Food and Drug Administration, the President's Commission on Mental Health, the President's Commission to Reform Special Education, and the National Institute of Mental Health Consensus Conference on ADHD. He has made more than 800 radio and television appearances, including CNN, Fox National News, NBC Dateline, and The Montel Williams Show, and has been quoted in print media across the country, including the New York Times. He has a master's degree in American history from the California State University at San Jose, and is the former chairman of the Department of History of John F. Kennedy University. Bruce is also the author of the compelling book, Psychiatry, The Ultimate Betrayal, and for 5 years hosted the acclaimed nationally syndicated radio show, Take America Back. And I'm so happy to have this opportunity to delve into this topic. So welcome to the show, Bruce.
Pat, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's our pleasure, and I want to just dig right in. I just stated that the epidemic of drugging our children has resulted in millions of children on psychiatric drugs, and as you say, that this sadly rests on one fraudulent premise, and that is that mental disorders are biological diseases, much like cancer or diabetes, and therefore justifies the use of mind-altering drugs. So why is this a fraudulent premise?
It's a great first question, and you're very wise to ask it because it lays at the foundation of psychiatry. And that so-called medical specialty has, through, for lack of a better word, just kind of PR ruse, pushed the idea that mental illness is somehow a biologic or some kind of chemical imbalance in the brain. The simple fact is that there are no biological tests for any mental illness, no CAT scans, no X-rays, no blood tests, no urinalysis. And if you talk to doctors and actually get them to answer the question, they admit that, everyone from psychiatrists to the head of the APA. There is no physiological basis for mental illness whatsoever. The book, Pat, that enumerates the so-called mental disorders, it's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the DSM for short, has got 374, it's probably grown now in the last year or so, but 374 mental disorders listed for which psychiatrists can bill. But in the introduction of that book, Psychiatry's Billing Bible, which is published by the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, they very clearly state that they don't really know what a mental disorder is. They can't tell the difference between one mental disorder and another mental disorder, or one mental disorder and no mental disorder. So here we stand, well into the 21st century, and we in the United States have got 8.25 million children on mind-altering drugs, many of them diagnosed with so-called ADHD, for which there is no physiological basis whatsoever. The kid butts into line, he interrupts the teacher, is energetic, and he's labeled with a mental disorder and given a drug, in many cases, brand names like Ritalin and Adderall, but the basic underlying generic name for those drugs is methylphenidate. And you have to be a PhD in chemistry, Pat, to know the difference between the methylphenidate molecule and cocaine. Mm-hmm. So, we spend billions and billions and billions on a war on drugs in this country, and kids line up in the halls of our school to get a fix-a-kitty Coke. For what? For some label that has been foisted on them by a psychiatrist.
Yeah, this is scary stuff, and it's not just children. Boy, I recognized this when my mom was in the hospital for 4 months. The psychiatric team came in and said they were going to do an evaluation. They kicked me out of the room, which I happened to stand in the hallway to listen. They came out 30 minutes later with these somber looks on their face and said, well, we asked your mom if she ever thought about dying, and she said yes. And so then they were going to prescribe these drugs to her. I said, you know what? We've been here for 4 months. If you ask me if I feel like dying, I'm going to say yes, too. I mean, that's not a far-fetched answer to that question. And then they proceeded giving her all of these crazy drugs, to which point then she was seeing babies on the wall and a nurses singing. And then a nurse came in and said, your mom had dementia. And that was my first clue as to what these kind of drugs can do. So if there's no way to diagnose, now these people are deciding what is normal. I mean, who's to say what normal is for a child?
Well, you're absolutely right, and those are the two most vulnerable publics that psychiatrists abuse: the elderly and youngsters. And the drugging of kids has just gotten just completely, Pat, out of hand. We have 1 million kids in this country. This is a study from 2013, age 0 to 5, that were put on psychiatric drugs. More than 1 million children 0 to 5, and the fastest growing segment of psychiatric drugging is infants 0 to 1.
Oh my God!
Because they have, quote, mental illnesses. It is outrageous, and because these guys, carry some pseudo authority, people listen to them. The drugging of the elderly is a commensurate crime, as far as I'm concerned, because that's exactly what happens, and the drugs create symptoms, and then those symptoms are labeled as further mental illness and justify further drugging, and the elderly are put into stupors unless there's somebody smart enough, like you or something, or the adult child to go, stop it. When you take this further, Pat, the drugs that are given to so many kids and adults are antidepressants. Yet there are 49 international drug regulatory warnings tying antidepressants, and when I say antidepressants, it's a class of psychiatric drugs like Prozac and Paxil and Zoloft, tying those drugs to suicide.
Yes.
When I was growing up, I don't know what generation you are, but when I was growing up, you didn't have kids running through the schools with AK-47. This all started with the diagnosing, the voting into the DSM. It's a political process, by the way.
Yes.
They vote these diagnoses into this book. There's no science to it. But once ADHD was voted into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, so it could be billed for, diagnoses screamed up, as did the drugging of youngsters.
So who are you saying the perpetrators are? Who's behind this? I mean, why are we doing this to our children?
The perpetrators here are the psychiatrists, because they're the ones that come up with the labels. Once they come up with the labels, they go to these conventions, they get into a committee. You can read testimony and books by people that have attended, and they sit around at a table and they discuss, okay, good, well, does, ADHD, the kid is impulsive or something, and then they vote how many people think this should be in the book. There are DVDs that we've produced that are on our website. You can give that if you choose.
Yes, please share that.
Well, our main website is cchrint.org. CCHRINT stands for international. CCHRINT.org. We have a series of free DVDs at our sister website, which is cchr.org. No int, cchr.org. There are videos up there that folks can watch. We make them available as a public service that show they don't know, because it's made up, Pat. It's made up. If you've got parents listening, folks, these drugs they're awfully dangerous. Now, I hasten to add, you don't withdraw from these things without having the care of a non-psychiatric medical doctor. Get a good doctor if you're thinking of withdrawing from them. But and I know we're focused on kids, but just to take this point of the damage that these drugs do, from 2005 to 2011, the number of psychiatric drugs that went into the military increased 646%. And, Pat, today there are 22 suicides by veterans every day.
Wow.
Every day.
Wow.
Every day. And these drugs that are being given to the vets are tied by study after study after study to suicide. So the psychiatrists that are coming up with these labels, and then they, of course, it's an insidious relationship between the psychiatrists and the pharmaceutical industry. Both of them make a fortune off of this, and the public suffers.
I was just going to say the other marriage partner is Big Pharma.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. And the third member of that is the FDA,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
who lets these poisons out into the public, despite the countless numbers of studies that show that they're damaging. It took us 13 years, along with other groups, to get the FDA to finally throw a black box warning on antidepressants for children, kids under 18, because the panelists at the FDA are on the payroll of the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, it sounds like a conspiracy book, except it's true.
Exactly. You've got a revolving door there. People are going in and out from one organization to the next, and they have a dog in the race, basically.
Yes, that's right.
You know, you talked about the black box warning, and again, when my mom was in the hospital, I didn't know anything about that. And once I realized what was going on with her, and I started to do my research and found these warnings that talked about suicide, and my mom was, trying to say, hey, cover my head with a pillow, tell the grandkids I'm sorry, but I can't be here any longer. And she was never like that before. So I'm assuming then that we're agreeing that these psychiatric drugs can very well be the cause of the violence and the suicide that are kind of the common denominator with what's going on in the school, with the killings and the crazy stuff that goes on.
Every single incidence of acts of senseless violence in these schools where we've been able to get the data ties these shooters to psychiatric drugs. Every single one of them where we've been able to get the data. Now, I add that last phrase because in some cases they cover it up. Mm-hmm. They won't let the information out, and have been in legal fight in Connecticut to get the medical records released of the shooter up there in December of 2013, and the government there, the medical examiner's office, I think it was somebody from the Attorney General's office, goes, we're not going to release the data that he was on antidepressants because it could prevent some people from taking their antidepressants. So we're not going to say what he was on.
Right.
I'm laughing because it's so ludicrous. The damage that they do, of course, is not at all. And as you note, the school shooters are on these drugs in every case we've been able to tell.
Interesting.
In Columbine, Eric Harris, we talked to the coroner right after that shooting, knowing, strongly suspecting that they were on psychiatric drugs. And the coroner said that they had done some tests. Coroners have to do special tests to find the evidence of antidepressants in the bloodstream or any kind of psychiatric drug. So we had called and said, be sure and do this test. And the coroner said, okay, fine. They were in very good communication. Then also the next day they were not talking at all. Wouldn't get out any information. Then they released a statement to the press going, no psychiatric drugs. The next day the Air Force came out and said, no, we rejected Eric Harris because he was on psychiatric drugs. And then the coroner went, oh yeah, we made a mistake. Yes, he was. So yes, these shootings, when you pull the string back, you find psychiatric drugs.
Interesting about the whole media concept, because that's another nasty partner. You've got mainstream media that just doesn't report the truth.
Television gets $5.3 billion a year in advertising from pharma.
Right.
They're not going to shoot the golden goose.
Let's talk about informed consent, because I'm assuming that many of these parents go to the doctor. The doctor says, hey, we need to give little Susie this, and off we go. And no one really knows what they're taking. They don't even know about the black box warning. What do you have to say about informed consent?
Well, you're asking some extremely important and valuable questions here, because that is an unbelievably important factor in what's going on here. The example that you just gave is exactly what happens. The parent goes in. You have a young mother who isn't studied up on these things. The teacher goes, Johnny's running around the school. He's got symptoms of ADHD. The mother goes to the psychiatrist, who, without 5 or 10 minutes, prescribes him methylphenidate. And the mom goes, the drug, okay, yeah, sure, it's fine. Maybe he may not eat quite as well or whatever. And they are not given the information. They are not told. They are not given informed consent. And it's a very strong platform that we push, that any time somebody is given drugs of this nature, they should be fully informed of the side effects of these drugs. It's just outrageous that the doctor just doctors, and I say that generally, just kind of blow that off and go, no, it should be fine. When study after studies at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, the State University of New York, studies published in their own peer-reviewed journals show these drugs tied to acts of suicide and senseless violence and mania and psychosis. It's all in the literature. Yeah. And yet the parents aren't informed. And so we push both at the state and federal level for informed consent whenever that's going to happen. We're trying to do that in the military. So when these guys are prescribed, these drugs, at least they know what's going to happen, or at least what the side effects are, potential side effects of these drugs.
Absolutely, absolutely. And when I think about parents succumbing to this, I almost sometimes get the feeling like, well, it's kind of like the cool thing to do. Everybody's doing it. It must be okay. Almost like an implied consent. Well, all the kids down the street are doing it. Now Susie's doing it too. There's
a world-class database at our website, Pat, again, cchrnt.org, that is, you can put in the name of any drug and you can get all of the information about that drug. Okay. You can get what it's supposed to be prescribed for, what the side effects are. It's a world-class drug database. There's nothing like it anywhere in the world. So if a parent, wants to know, the doctor goes, Johnny or Susie should take this, they can go search and find out on their own. Because in this day and age, as you bring up, parents need to be responsible themselves and not just follow blindly what some person says.
Now, I also want to make it clear that a teacher or a school cannot mandate that your child take this drug as a condition of attending that school. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct.
All right, let's talk about that.
And a lot of folks don't know that. We were getting, that's modesty aside, that's a result of our work.
Great.
We were getting calls in frequently from mothers who were going, they won't let Johnny in school or Susie in school unless they're on Ritalin. In other words, a child can't get into a classroom unless they're on a mind-altering drug. How bizarre is that? And so we spent 2 years working with the folks in the House and in the Senate, and finally got legislation passed that very specifically says you can't force a parent to put a kid on a psychotropic drug as a condition of going to school, signed into law in 2004. It's something for parents to know because they'll get pressure. They often get pressure because the schools will get more money if the kid is labeled disabled. And if they have an ADHD label, they're, quote, disabled. There are instances of mothers in one northern state, I think it was Michigan, the parent would tell the kid to go to school and act strangely so that they would get a label. Once they get a label, the parent would get increased Social Security disability checks.
Oh, my goodness.
The ramifications, the problems spread out. But at the basis of it, it goes back and you find the psychiatrist is creating these labels out of whole cloth. I mean, you read this book, Pat, for youngsters or adults, psychiatric diagnosis, sibling rivalry disorder. I don't know if you grew up with a sibling. I did.
Yeah.
And my brother and I, who love each other dearly today, boy, we had our fights,
Oh, I hadn't heard of that disorder. Oh.
Sibling rivalry disorder. There's also phase of life problem.
Oh.
On it goes, anyway.
And I'm sure there's a drug for that, right?
Yeah, that's right. There's a drug for all of them.
Oh, my gosh. Now, this might sound kind of weird, but is this some sort of form of mind control?
The drugs?
Yeah, I mean, is there a plan? I mean, I can't understand how this wasn't going on when I was in school, and now it's happening now, and it seems like everything is so crazy in our world today, and you've got the curriculum that's going on in schools that has nothing to do with learning and all about testing, and so if you have any free thinker or somebody that's a dreamer or whatever, we have to give them a drug. So it almost seems like some sort of bizarre form of controlling the mind, so so that we're regurgitating out nice little cookie cutter soldiers.
If someone's on a mind-altering drug, they're very susceptible to those kinds of commands and directions and so forth. I mean, 8 million kids, 8.25 million kids on these drugs. This is not just some little blip on a screen. This is millions and millions and millions of children. Do psychiatrists have some plan to, or others have some plan to do this to control the population? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
Here's what I do know the answer to. These guys make up these diagnoses, slap them on kids and adults, prescribe the meds, and rake in billions. You mentioned at the opening of the show 20 million children, that's planet-wide, on these drugs, and it generates hundreds of billions of dollars to the mental health industry. The simple truth is, and this is hard for people to swallow, really, psychiatry is a fraud. They don't know what the mind is. The psychiatrist doesn't know what the mind is. Their own billing Bible says they don't know what it is. We've got videos up on that site, if folks go look at them, where people have gone into different psychiatrists with a hidden camera under the lapel, and they go, I'm not feeling well, or like you were talking about your mom, you're not eating well, you're not sleeping the same, my diet's changed or whatever, and they get one diagnosis in one place and another diagnosis in another place and another diagnosis in another place. What's common is they all get prescribed some kind of mind-altering medication.
Right. Yep. Wow, I just want folks to really be wary of this, because the whole bottom line sounds like it's follow the money. It
is follow the money. It is follow the money. It's greed at a stunning rate, and the amount of fraud that goes on. Forget the psychiatric diagnosis is made up and of whole cloth. Even the billings that they do to both the government insurance systems and private insurance, studies show about a third of that is fraudulent. They bill for visits they never made. They bill for walking through a psych ward and shaking hands with people. It's an area of physical, mental, and financial abuse is the point that you're making, and it's why we do what we do.
I'm so glad you do what you do. You mentioned something just a few moments ago. I want to touch on that again. I want to get a handle on that. You said something about the schools. If the child is labeled as disabled, the school has something to gain. Can you explain that again?
Yes, there's kind of a complicated system between the federal funding and the state funding for kids that are labeled with, mental disorders, but the bottom line is it generates income. And those there's different programs that do it depending on what level of the state you're at and so forth, but they benefit. So yes, that occurs.
So the school actually has a financial dog in that race as well.
Yes.
All right, that's what's really scary. Okay. Yeah. So what should parents do if their provider suggests drugs as the first line of a cure for little Johnny when he doesn't behave like the rest of the kids? Let's lay out a little bit of a plan for folks listening. What should they do to buck against that, or to at least make an informed decision?
Well, the first thing they should do is go, you're prescribing a drug? Where are the tests? What tests? You're prescribing a powerful drug here. Where are the tests? There aren't any tests, Pat. So the answer is, I don't know what the doctor's going to say, but there are no tests. So that's the first thing a parent should do. If a kid is having trouble, there are different things to check for. In some cases, it can be as simple as nutrition. Some parents send kids to school with a half a dozen donuts under their belt, or a ton of sugar in their diet, and not enough nutrition. In some cases, the child simply hasn't been taught to read, and when they're forced to read things that they don't understand, phonics has been taken out of the school system by psychologists, I hasten to add. And so if a kid can't read, that has very direct effects. They'll get anxious, they'll get frustrated, they'll act out, there'll be behavior problems in the classroom. In some cases, it's an environmental situation. There may be environmental toxins. The child may have an allergy. We work with some healthcare providers across the country where kids have been labeled ADHD. The parent went, I don't think so. They went to a good non-psychiatric medical doctor and had allergy tests. I've seen videos of kids that were allergic to strawberries, and the kid is fine, and they eat a few strawberries, and they become like a Tasmanian devil. So these things should be checked for. There can be some underlying physical cause, and when the physical cause, actual medical cause, is handled, the so-called psychiatric symptoms go away. So those are some tools that a parent can know and use. The last thing they should do, if they've got some doctor prescribing a mind-altering drug to a child, that doctor is following. I mean, a lot of these doctors are on pharma payroll, by the way.
Yes.
They speak for the pharmaceutical industry. They assign articles for the pharmaceutical industry. So there are other ways to solve it if a child's having some issues.
Yeah, interesting. I did a little expose several weeks back about doctors, and there's actually a website where you can go to see how much they've been reimbursed via the pharmaceutical company. It's kind of interesting. So what we're saying here is that there is no diagnostic test. You can't take a CAT scan or a blood test that can confirm to say that, yes, your child has a mental disorder and we need to prescribe this drug to treat that. It's not like diabetes or cancer or anything like that. Now, you're talking about toxins. Have you ever given any consideration to the wireless technology that's being foisted on in the schools and the fact of the high levels of radio frequencies given off by wireless technologies that are now in all of the schools, and what role that might play in behavior problems? And then you combine that with the drugs, and who knows what that interacts with those kind of drugs?
It's a very good point. Our focus, I mean, as a side note, I have studied and read a good deal about it. In fact, my wife was just bringing me some material about this the other day. It's not CCHR's focus. Our focus is investigating and exposing psychiatric abuse.
Mm-hmm.
The other things that are going on in classrooms of the nature of which you speak are also problems. That's just a personal opinion based on my own reading and research. It's not CCHR's agenda. But you're absolutely right to the degree there are. Well, let me go back to the point that you made earlier. The kid on these drugs is much more susceptible to all kinds of mental things. Mm-hmm. Because their mind has been altered, their brain chemistry has been altered.
Right. I mean, we've done a lot of research on the radio frequencies given off by cell phones in particular. And when you put that up to your ear, then it causes the blood-brain barrier to open up. And so I'm going to assume that if now you're ingesting all of these drugs and the brain barrier is open, there's a greater chance then that those chemicals in the drugs can transfer to the brain a lot quicker and maybe create those bizarre reactions.
That's a very good point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very good point.
Yeah, I just think we need to look at all of these things because we're not working in a vacuum here. It's not just the drug. It can very well be the environment. And so we better start taking a good, strong look at what we're doing to our kids.
Exactly right. And food, rest, parents' love, exercise.
Yep.
There's nothing more valuable than a parent's love, but to any child. But add to that in terms of their physical well-being. So many kids now are not outside and exercising and, playing ball or tennis or whatever. Just get them outside and fresh air and exercise and a good diet and sunshine. Those simple basics that brought this country along for hundreds of years are the right solutions. It's kind of like what your grandmother said, and that is what my grandmother said.
Yeah, exactly. It's back to the good old days. Well, now I know there's so much more we can talk about, and this is such a rich topic, but just for time constraints, is there anything that you want to mention today that we haven't talked about?
Thank you for asking that question. One of the things that we're doing right now is we've launched a petition to prevent the psychiatric drugging of kids in California's foster care system, which is just outrageous.
Wow.
Pat, these kids are on 2, 3, 4 psychiatric drugs. The kids in foster care are drugged 3.5 times the rate of other kids, and it's just outrageous. So folks go to our website, cchrint.org, and they'll find a place that they can sign that petition so that we get this toxic assault on these youngsters stopped. It's really, the foster kids in particular are so vulnerable. So many of these children are being drugged into stupors. It's a real crime.
Oh, I hadn't given that any thought. Yeah, and then they don't have a parental voice, and they're just at the whim of the organization that's caring for them, I guess, huh?
A friend of mine had a facility for kids at risk. He had a residential home, and he had a great home for these kids, and they were doing quite well. And he didn't drug the kids, even though a lot of them were sent to him with so-called diagnoses. It made a difference, Pat, of $66,000 a month that he turned down because he refused to drug these children. So, if they're labeled and drugged, then there's all kinds of state and federal benefits that accrue to providers of at-risk youth, which encourages them to drug the kid.
Wow, this is such a huge topic, isn't it?
It is a huge topic.
And lots of arms. I mean, it's not just kids, as you said, it's seniors and foster and military, and just so many ways we can go here. We're going to probably have to have you back sometime to really delve into some of these other topics and get your thoughts on that as well. But I so appreciate your taking the time to be with us today. And so the website folks should go to is cchrint.org. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
All right. Bruce, what a pleasure to have you on the show, and let's stay in touch. And keep us posted as new information comes along. Share it with us, and I will share it with our listeners.
Thank you so much, Pat. I appreciate being on the show and appreciate your kind words.